I am H. Holmes, though I was born Herman Webster Mudgett. Let me tell you how a boy from New Hampshire became America's first serial killer and the architect of Chicago's infamous murder castle. The fascination with death began early. Growing up in Gilmanton, New Hampshire in the 1860s, I discovered I had a talent for anatomy and a peculiar immunity to the horror of death. Other children bullied me until they discovered my fondness for dissection. Fear, I learned young, is a powerful tool for controlling others. Medical school at the University of Michigan gave me my first real opportunities. The shortage of cadavers for study presented a profitable scheme. Steal bodies, artificially age them, and collect insurance money. It was here I perfected the art of fraud, learning how to manipulate both the living and the dead. Let me tell you about my first experiments with murder. During medical school, I discovered how to make people disappear. A friend, a lover, a business partner, they would vanish and I would collect their insurance policies. The thrill wasn't in the money, though that was useful. The real excitement came from the perfect execution of the plan. But Chicago was where I found my true calling. The 1893 World's Fair was coming, bringing millions of visitors to the city. I began construction of my building at 63rd and Wallace Streets. 3 stories tall, an entire block long, it appeared to be a hotel and business complex. Only I knew its true purpose. The murder castle, as newspapers would later call it, was my masterpiece. Soundproof rooms with gas lines I could control, secret chutes to the basement, hidden rooms, fake walls, stairways that led nowhere. I personally supervised every detail of construction, firing workers who asked too many questions. No one but me knew the complete layout. The basement contained my most elaborate tools: dissection tables, acid vats, a crematorium. The upper floors were a maze of nearly 100 rooms, many windowless, with doors that could only be opened from the outside. Some rooms were airtight and connected to gas lines. Others had blowtorch-like devices built into the walls. Young women were my preferred targets, particularly those arriving in Chicago seeking work or adventure. I would hire them as secretaries or clerks, require them to take out life insurance naming me as beneficiary. Then they would vanish into the depths of my castle. The World's Fair brought an endless supply of victims. The World's Fair of 1893 made my operation perfect. Thousands of young women arriving in Chicago, seeking jobs, adventure, a new life. So many disappeared during those months that newspapers called the fair the White City Devil's hunting ground. No one suspected the respectable Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, businessman and hotelier. My building was a masterpiece of malevolent architecture. Every detail was planned for a purpose. Take the airtight rooms. I told contractors they were for storage. In reality, I could pipe in gas to study how long it took different victims to succumb. Some rooms had peepholes so I could observe their final moments. Science, you understand, requires careful observation. Let me tell you about my methods. I would hire young women, preferably blonde, always beautiful, usually from out of town. They needed references. I provided them. A place to stay? My hotel welcomed them. Life insurance? A sensible precaution for a young woman alone in the big city. I was so helpful, so trustworthy, so concerned for their welfare. The most elaborate rooms had microphones installed. I told my victims it was an advanced hotel communication system. Really, I wanted to record their last words, their final gasps. Some rooms had blowtorches built into the walls. I could activate them at will, studying how humans reacted to extreme heat. The screams were absorbed by my soundproof walls. The basement was my true domain. 2 large furnaces, acid vats, dissection tables. Human bodies are difficult to dispose of, but I had mastered the process. Strip the flesh, articulate the skeleton. I could sell those to medical schools. Dissolve what remained in acid. Nothing wasted. I was methodical, scientific. Julia Connor arrived in 1891 with her daughter Pearl. She became my mistress, working in my pharmacy. Eventually, she became suspicious about my other employees. She and Pearl disappeared into the basement. I sold her skeleton to a medical school. Pearl's fate? Some questions are best left unanswered. Minnie Williams brought her sister Nanny to Chicago in 1893. Minnie was beautiful, educated, and wealthy. Perfect. I seduced her, convinced her to transfer her property to me, then dispatched both sisters. But Minnie served me well even after death. I used her handwriting as a template to forge letters to her relatives explaining her move to Europe. The World's Fair of 1893 made my operation perfect. Thousands of young women arriving in Chicago, seeking jobs, adventure, a new life. So many disappeared during those months that newspapers called the fair the White City Devil's hunting ground. No one suspected the respectable Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, businessman and hotelier. My building was a masterpiece of malevolent architecture. Every detail was planned for a purpose. Take the airtight rooms. I told contractors they were for storage. In reality, I could pipe in gas to study how long it took different victims to succumb. Some rooms had peepholes so I could observe their final moments. Science, you understand, requires careful observation. Let me tell you about my methods. I would hire young women, preferably blonde, always beautiful, usually from out of town. They needed references. I provided them. A place to stay? My hotel welcomed them. Life insurance? A sensible precaution for a young woman alone in the big city. I was so helpful, so trustworthy, so concerned for their welfare. The most elaborate rooms had microphones installed. I told my victims it was an advanced hotel communication system. Really, I wanted to record their last words, their final gasps. Some rooms had blowtorches built into the walls. I could activate them at will, studying how humans reacted to extreme heat. The screams were absorbed by my soundproof walls. The basement was my true domain. 2 large furnaces, acid vats, dissection tables. Human bodies are difficult to dispose of, but I had mastered the process. Strip the flesh, articulate the skeleton. I could sell those to medical schools. Dissolve what remained in acid. Nothing wasted. I was methodical, scientific. Julia Connor arrived in 1891 with her daughter Pearl. She became my mistress, working in my pharmacy. Eventually, she became suspicious about my other employees. She and Pearl disappeared into the basement. I sold her skeleton to a medical school. Pearl's fate? Some questions are best left unanswered. Minnie Williams brought her sister Nanny to Chicago in 1893. Minnie was beautiful, educated, and wealthy. Perfect. I seduced her, convinced her to transfer her property to me, then dispatched both sisters. But Minnie served me well even after death. I used her handwriting as a template to forge letters to her relatives, explaining her move to Europe. The interrogations seemed endless. Detective Geyer had a particular talent for getting under my skin. His calm demeanor, his methodical questioning, his absolute certainty of my guilt. He wasn't interested in my genius or my methods. He just wanted to know about those children. Let me tell you about those final days with the Pittercell children. Howard was curious, intelligent, too intelligent. He asked too many questions about his father's whereabouts. In Indianapolis, I rented a house where I experimented with chloroform on him before disposing of his body in the chimney. Alice and Nellie lasted longer, writing innocent letters to their mother that I never mailed. Toronto was their final stop. The city where Detective Geyer would eventually find their bodies in a trunk. The investigation of my castle revealed horrors even I had almost forgotten. The basement's dissection table still had scratch marks from fingernails. They found hair in the acid vats, bones in the lime pits. My careful record-keeping became evidence against me. Each insurance policy, each deed transfer, each forged letter helped build the case. The newspapers couldn't get enough of the story. The arch-fiend, they called me, the modern Bluebeard. The Chicago Tribune ran detailed floor plans of the castle, showing all my hidden rooms and torture chambers. They interviewed former guests who had heard strange noises at night, but escaped my attention. Every day brought new revelations, new horrors. My employees were questioned extensively. Pat Quinlan, my janitor, knew more than he initially admitted. He would later commit suicide, leaving a note that suggested he couldn't live with what he knew. Benjamin Pittersal's widow testified against me, describing how I had led her across the country while I was actually killing her children. During my imprisonment, I wrote my confession, for a price, of course. The Philadelphia North American paid handsomely for my story. I admitted to 27 murders, though I lied about many details. Some I claimed to have killed were actually alive. Others I had killed weren't mentioned at all. The confession was my final performance, mixing truth with lies until even I sometimes couldn't tell the difference. The trial itself was surprisingly brief. The evidence for Pittersal's murder was overwhelming. My own confession, though filled with lies, helped seal my fate. The jury took just 3 hours to find me guilty. The judge showed no mercy in sentencing me to death. Let me tell you about my final days in Moyamensing prison. I remained calm, collected, continuing to give interviews and write letters. I complained that the constant watching was preventing me from sleeping. Rich irony from someone who had so often watched others during their final moments. The guards found my demeanor unsettling. I discussed my execution with the same detached interest I had shown in my experiments. I made specific requests about my burial. I wanted my coffin filled with cement and buried 10 feet deep. Was I afraid of grave robbers, or worried my victims might come for me? May 7th, 1896, was my appointment with the gallows. My neck didn't break from the drop. It took 15 minutes for me to strangle to death. Perhaps it was fitting that my death would be slow, given how many slow deaths I had orchestrated. My murder castle burned shortly after my arrest. Insurance fraud, ironically, but parts of it survived, becoming a macabre tourist attraction. Today, a post office stands on the site. They say postal workers still report strange sounds, unexplained cold spots. The legend grew after my death. Books, movies, television shows all tried to explain what made me what I was. They called me America's first serial killer, though that's not strictly true. I was just the first to industrialize it, to turn murder into an efficient, methodical business. From my prison cell, I watched my stories spread across America. The newspapers couldn't get enough. Every detail of my castle, every victim discovered, every twist in my complicated web of murder and fraud became front-page news. They called me the Devil in the White City, linking my crimes forever with Chicago's Grand World's Fair. Let me tell you about the myths that grew around my crimes. They said I sold skeletons to medical schools. True. They said I had a machine that stripped flesh from bones. False. Though the reality of acid vats and dissection tables was perhaps worse. They claimed I killed as many as 200 people during the World's Fair. The real number, even I lost count. My confessions played with truth and fiction. The Philadelphia North American paid me well for my story, but I gave them a mixture of fact and fantasy. I admitted to some murders while denying others. I implicated the dead and exonerated the living. Some I claimed to have killed were found alive. Others I never mentioned were certainly among my victims. The investigation continued long after my execution. Detective Geyer became famous for uncovering my crimes, writing his own book about the case. He was particularly haunted by the Pittersell children, Howard stuffed in a chimney, Alice and Nellie killed in Toronto. Those deaths seemed to affect him more than all my other crimes. My murder castle fascinated the public. Tourists would try to visit the ruins after the fire, taking souvenirs from the ashes. Every brick, every piece of charred wood became a collector's item. The site's current occupant, a post office, still draws curious visitors. They say employees report strange sounds, unexplained cold spots, as if my victims still haunt the ground where they died. Modern profilers have analysed my methods extensively. They note my charm, my intelligence, my ability to manipulate others. I kept detailed records, planned meticulously, showed no remorse. The perfect psychopath, they say. But such labels seem inadequate to explain the complexity of my operations. The stories about my death vary. Some say I remained calm until the end, discussing my execution with clinical detachment. Others claim I showed fear in my final moments. The truth? I faced the gallows, as I had faced everything, with careful observation of the process. My neck didn't break in the hanging. It took 15 minutes to die. My final request for cement in my coffin and extra deep burial suggests I feared something. Perhaps the vengeance of my victims' spirits. My methods influenced crime investigation techniques. Police began paying more attention to missing persons reports, especially during large events like the World's Fair. Insurance companies tightened their procedures for verifying deaths and investigating claims. My case showed how easily systems could be manipulated by someone willing to plan carefully and think long-term. The books, movies, and documentaries continue to proliferate. Erik Larson's The Devil in the White City brought my story to a new generation. Each retelling adds new layers to the legend, tries to understand what made me what I was. Was it the childhood fascination with surgery, the medical training, or was I simply born different, capable of seeing people as objects for experimentation rather than living beings? The myth-making began even before my execution. Every newspaper in America wanted to explain how a respected doctor and businessman could be such a monster. They explored my childhood in New Hampshire, interviewed my teachers, my first wife, anyone who had known H. Holmes before he became America's nightmare. My methods fascinated criminologists. I wasn't just a killer, I was an architect of death. The murder castle wasn't built in a frenzy of madness, it was carefully planned, each room designed for a specific purpose. The gas lines, the soundproof walls, the secret chutes to the basement, everything served a function. I approached murder with the same precision I had learned in medical school. Let me tell you about the copycats who followed. Every killer with a murder house owes something to my design. They study the plans of my castle, trying to understand how I created such an efficient killing factory. But they miss the point. It wasn't the building that made my operation successful. It was the careful planning, the attention to detail, the ability to appear completely normal to the outside world. The insurance companies changed their entire investigation process because of me. Before my crimes, they barely verified deaths before paying claims. I showed them how easily their system could be exploited. My schemes were so complex that they're still studied by fraud investigators today. Every fake death, every forged document, every false identity was meticulously crafted. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 will forever be linked with my name. The contrast was perfect for storytellers. The glittering, white city of the fair and the dark castle of death just a few miles away. Millions came to see the future of American progress. Dozens disappeared into my basement, never to be seen again. It's like a fairy tale, except the monster won, at least for a while. Detective Guyer's investigation became a template for modern police work. He tracked me across multiple states, following a trail of property records, insurance papers, and hotel registries. His methods were revolutionary for the time, creating timelines, collecting photographs, interviewing witnesses systematically. Today's detectives still study his work. The Pittersell case particularly captivates people, perhaps because it was different from my usual methods, killing a friend, then manipulating his widow while murdering her children. The cross-country journey with those children, keeping them separated, writing letters to their mother, pretending they were alive. Even hardened criminals found this especially horrifying. Modern profilers say I was unique among serial killers. Most kill from compulsion, with minimal planning. I created an entire business enterprise around murder. The insurance scams, the property frauds, the carefully maintained respectability. It was all part of a complex operation. They call me an organized killer, but that barely captures the scope of what I built. My castle's design continues to fascinate architects and historians. The trick was in making it appear normal from the outside, while containing all those secret rooms and passages. The building codes were different then. I could fire contractors who asked too many questions, supervise all the work myself. Today's killers can't operate on that scale. There's too much oversight. The stories about hauntings began immediately after my execution. People reported seeing ghosts in and around my property. The women I killed, they said, wandered the halls at night. The children's spirits played in empty rooms. Even after the castle burned and was demolished, the legends persisted. The post office workers still report unexplained phenomena. Every new book or documentary about me tries to find some new angle, some unexplored aspect of my crimes. They analyze my childhood, my medical training, my relationships. They count my victims. Was it 27 as I claimed? 200 as some estimated? The true number died with me. My final days in Moyamensing prison gave me time to craft my last deception, my confession. The Philadelphia North American paid handsomely for exclusive rights to my story. But like everything in my life, the truth was buried under layers of lies. Let me tell you about these supposed confessions. I admitted to 27 murders, a number I chose carefully, enough to satisfy the public's appetite for horror, but not so many as to seem unbelievable. Some I claim to have killed were later found alive. Others I never mentioned are certainly among my victims. Even in confession, I played my games. The details I chose to share were calculated. I described my medical experiments in clinical terms, speaking like the doctor I was trained to be. The newspapers wanted a monster, but I gave them a scientist. I was born with the devil in me, I wrote. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than a poet can help the inspiration to sing. My letter to the children of my victims was particularly theatrical. I wrote about being pursued by ghosts, about dark urges I couldn't control. Pure fiction, of course. I never felt guilt or remorse. The letter was just another performance, giving people what they wanted. The story of a tormented killer, rather than the truth of a methodical businessman who saw murder as simply another profitable venture. The execution was scheduled for May 7th, 1896. I requested my body be encased in cement and buried 10 feet deep. Some said I feared grave robbers who might sell my body to medical schools. Ironic, given how many bodies I had sold myself. Others thought I feared my victims would come for me. The truth was simpler. One final mystery to leave behind. They say I remained calm until the end, discussing my hanging with the same detached interest I showed in all my experiments. The drop didn't break my neck. It took 15 minutes to die by strangulation. My last words? Take your time. Don't bungle it. Even then, I was directing my own death. My story grows with each retelling. Books, movies, documentaries, each tries to understand what made me what I was. Was it the childhood fascination with surgery, the medical training, or was I simply born, as I claimed, with the devil in me? The truth is probably less dramatic. I simply saw opportunities others wouldn't take. My death marked the end of my story, but it was only the beginning of the legend. As the rope tightened around my neck, I felt no fear, no regret. The executioner's hands trembled more than mine. 15 minutes of slow strangulation, a fitting finale for someone who had engineered so many intricate deaths. My body twitched, my vision blurred, and at last, darkness came. And yet, my legacy did not end with the gallows. The murder castle became infamous, immortalized as a monument to ingenuity turned toward pure evil. Some say the castle burned to the ground in an act of poetic justice. But its footprint, its ghost, lingered. A post office now stands on the site, but the whispers remain. Cold drafts, faint cries. The sensation of being watched. My victims, some believe, never truly left. I left behind a trail of horrors that continues to captivate. investigators combed through every room, every passageway of my castle. Horrified by the scale of my operation, architects marveled at the precision of its construction, each hidden chute and airtight chamber a testament to my skill. Criminologists dissected my motives, trying to understand how one man could orchestrate such calculated evil. The question of how many lives I took will never be answered. 27? 50? 200? Even I lost count. But let me tell you the real reason my name lingers. It's not the murders alone, gruesome though they were. It's what I represented, the shadow beneath the glittering surface of progress. The 1893 World's Fair was a celebration of modernity, invention, and human achievement. And yet, just a few miles away, I turned those very innovations, architecture, chemistry, medical science, into instruments of death. I was the other side of the coin, the darkness that progress often ignores. They called me the devil in the White City, and perhaps the name fits. I showed America that evil doesn't always wear a mask. It smiles, shakes your hand, offers you a room to stay. It builds a castle, not with blackened stones, but with gleaming marble and brass, hiding its true purpose behind charm and civility. And what of me now? Am I a ghost, pacing the halls of my castle, reliving my crimes? Or am I gone entirely, my soul as irretrievable as the bones I dissolved in acid? I like to think I remain in the stories, the whispered tales told late at night, the endless attempts to understand what drove me. Perhaps you, too, are drawn to the darkness, seeking answers to questions better left unanswered. You may wonder if the devil truly resides in men like me, but let me offer this final thought. The devil doesn't create, he only reveals. What you see in me is what you fear in yourselves. That, more than anything, is why my story endures. For even after death, I remain H. Holmes, the man who built a castle of death in the heart of America's shining city. And though my flesh is gone, my name will haunt the shadows of history forever.